morning. I hope everyone joining us today is safe and healthy. We are very glad that you are here, and it's an exciting morning here at the Natural History Museum of Utah in Salt Lake City. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge with respect that the land we gather on today is the homelands and pathways of the indigenous peoples of this land, and we acknowledge that the ancestral and 8 contemporary sovereign nations are the original stewards of this land. For those of you who've been joining Research Quest Live since mid-March, thank you for continuing to learn alongside us. And we have appreciated all the feedback and support and questions so far, so keep those coming in. For first-time visitors to Research Quest Live, welcome. I am Tracy Collins, and I am an educator here at the museum. And I'm one of the Research Quest instructors. Research Quest is a real-time interactive version of NHMU's Research Quest, an award-winning online education platform. It features museum scientists, research, and collections that drive scientific discovery and critical thinking. So thank you all for joining us for this conversation. It's a big one. We're really excited. And to give you all the details, it's my pleasure to introduce the Executive Director of the Natural History Museum of Utah, Dr. Jason Cryan.
Thank you so much, Tracy, and good morning to everyone. I'm really thrilled to be joining you for today's special episode of Research Quest Live. Before we kick things off, and for those of you who may just be joining us, this is the Natural History Museum of Utah, and this is Research Quest Live, our award-winning free online education platform that advances the scientific discovery and critical thinking. So today's episode is one of a series of classes and live question and answer series that are available at our website, nhmu.utah.edu. My name is Jason Cryan, the museum's executive director. However, I'm also a scientist. I'm an evolutionary biologist, and I specialize on insect biodiversity and discovery. As a scientist, I'm thrilled and I'm honored to introduce today's very special guest, astronaut and author, Captain Scott Kelly. Scott's a former NASA astronaut who's best known for spending nearly a year on the International Space Station. During that year-long mission known as worldwide as the Year in Space, he conducted 3 spacewalks before returning home in March of 2016. Scott's traveled more than 200 million miles. That's more than twice the distance to the sun. He's orbited the Earth more than 8,300 times, and he's near the top of the list of Americans who've spent the most time in space. That's amazing. For all of those amazing achievements, Scott's been honored with a bunch of awards, including the Defense Superior Service Medal, the Legion of Merit and Distinguished Flying Cross, and he's also a New York Times best-selling author. And that really puts my achievement of binge watching the entire series of Big Bang Theory in perspective. So I'd like to say welcome, Scott. Thank you so much for being with us. It's great to see you on Research Quest Live, and let's dive right in. So Tracy, can you get us started?
Yes, so thank you, Jason. Scott, as you know, it's not the first time that you virtually connected with the museum. The first was in 2015 when you answered questions via video from space to a group of students gathered at the museum. It was a fantastic event. And while we could see you that day, you could not see us. So we wanted to give you a sense of what the experience was like for everyone here at NHMU and just share a quick video.
Testing from Salt Lake City. Can you hear us, Commander Kelly?
Yeah, have you loud and clear. Good to hear you. And welcome aboard the space station.
Thank you.
Well, now our students have some great questions for you.
What was going through your mind when you found out you'd been chosen for this one-year mission?
Have you ever seen something in space that you cannot explain?
What was the most surprising thing about space that no amount of training can prepare you for?
You know, what I remember from my first flight was that I was very surprised at how beautiful the Earth was from space. And I had a little bit of a reminder on that on this flight a month ago when I did my first spacewalks ever. And, you know, that's something your training doesn't prepare you for.
I want to ask the Glendale students to join me in saying goodbye from Salt Lake and good luck up there. Thank you, Commander Kelly.
My pleasure. Thank you. I really enjoyed your questions and sharing the space station with you today.
Okay, so that was just over 4 years ago. One of the students that asked you a question that day, a 6th grader at the time, is still involved with the museum's youth programs. Shalali is now in 10th grade. And we are so pleased to give that student the chance to ask the first question. And so here's the question that he submitted, which is particularly relevant for all of us in quarantine right now. So knowing everything you know now, following your experience in space, if you could tell your past self something to bring along to the space station, what would it be?
Well, thank you, Tracy, and thank you, Jason, for inviting me to this event. Before we get into the questions, I just wanted to have the opportunity, to address the audience. I understand there are a lot of kids out there. Perhaps this is part of their, their daily, learning. Maybe it's an educational event because they're being homeschooled now, essentially. And, I'd just like to talk directly to them, and then we can get into the questions. We got plenty of time, and I'm not going anywhere anytime soon. So, I recognize that this is a challenging experience for everybody involved. And, in my career at NASA, there was always opportunities to be anxious. There were opportunities to be even frightened by what I was getting ready to do, whether it was launching on a rocket, whether it was doing a spacewalk, coming home in a spacecraft. Certainly can be a scary moment. But what I always found that made me and helped me get through that is that when I focused on the things that I had control over, my job, my knowledge and education that prepared me for what I was trying to do, a certain level of attention to detail, the rules, in NASA, we have flight rules that we follow. When I focused in on those things, it caused me to be less scared, less anxious. And I think, we're kind of in a similar situation now where we are all, probably for the first time in my life, engaged in one singular event as a species, fighting this pandemic. And this is our mission. And we need to focus on it. And as a kid out there, the way you can do the best possible job on defeating this pandemic is to follow what your parents are saying, your teachers, do your homework. You never know what opportunities are going to present themselves when you get older. And even though you might look at this as a chance to maybe take a little break, a little breather, education is so important because we need problem solvers, not only for this pandemic, but also in life. Having people that can think critically, that can make decisions based on their education, based on being informed, based on the data, is so important to our society. So I encourage the kids out there, to focus on the stuff they have control over, taking care of their environment, listening to their parents, learning. What a great opportunity it is to learn when you have very little else to do, right? I think it's a great time too for kids. I was not a great student growing up, and I never really had the opportunity to make a recovery until I got to college and found some inspiration, but you do now. For me, inspiration was very important. I found it in a book written by Tom Wolfe called The Right Stuff. And look for inspiration wherever you can find it. Be engaged, follow the rules, the guidance, do your very best, And if we all do that, we will get through this together. So let me answer the first question. And I didn't write the person's name down. What was her name?
His name is Shilali.
Shilali. So I didn't write his name down, but the question was, I think if I could go back in time and bring something else to space with me. Okay. If I could go back in time and to bring anything else in space with me that wasn't like a person to share this incredible experience with, which I don't think you were thinking a person, what I would bring is less stuff. Because when you're in space and everything floats, managing your stuff is a huge overhead to everyday life. I mean, think about it in your house, in your room, wherever you might be right now. Look around you. And if you could not put anything down on the table, the floor, everything had to be put away or Velcro to a wall or taped down or in your pocket, how much more complicated that would make your life. I said to my wife, Amiko, recently, that if I had the opportunity to spend a year in space or a year in quarantine in my apartment in Houston, the apartment wins every time. And just because it's easier to live here. I recognize everyone's situation is different. I'm just speaking for myself. And, when all your stuff is not floating around, having less stuff in space is what I would bring. Less is more sometimes, for real.
Yeah, that is so hard to imagine, the challenges that would create. Well, we're going to go ahead and we're going to be moving into our question and answer time. If you have questions for Scott, of course, you can submit that with the Ask a Question button. That is on our live stream at the museum's website, researchquestlive.org. And I will go ahead and turn it over to Jason to ask the first question.
Excellent, thanks. I'm going to kick it off by asking Scott, you just mentioned the book by Thomas Wolfe, The Right Stuff, and that's a great inspiration. Is there a moment, though, in your childhood, maybe before you read that, where you can point to that, where you kind of realized that a career in exploration and a career in discovery is what sparked your interest?
When I was in the first grade, I was in the boys' bathroom and at my school doing, what first grade boys do in there. I was standing next to my classmates and probably both peeing on the floor. This kid turns to me and he says, hey, Scott, what are you going to do when you grow up? And I said, I don't know, play baseball for the Mets. Maybe. I was a Mets fan. I grew up in New Jersey. And this kid turns to me, he goes, I'm going to be an astronaut. So I thought how cool that was. So of course, I said, well, I'm going to be an astronaut too. This kid says to me, he goes, looks down at me. He's like, you can't be an astronaut because I'm going to be an astronaut. Now, this was not my twin brother, Mark, who also went on to fly in space. It'd probably be a better story if it was him. But yeah, I said that, but I never actually believed it. Never dreamed of it. In maybe I dreamed of it in this kid kind of way, you dream to play with dinosaurs and be a race car driver, but it wasn't a real aspiration. And the reason it wasn't was I never actually thought it was possible for me. It was just too lofty a goal for a kid that wasn't a good student. But what I learned is that if you find inspiration, and then if that inspiration can make you focus. When I read the book, The Right Stuff, I recognized there were traits that the guys had, these fighter pilots that became test pilots, that became the original Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo astronauts. There were traits that these guys had that I felt deeply that I had in common with them, with only one exception. I mean, besides the fact that I didn't know how to fly an airplane, but as far as a basic skill, was that I was not a good student. And I thought, if I could just become a good student, it would just open up the whole world to me. And maybe I could be a pilot in the military, maybe even a Navy pilot, and maybe if not a Navy pilot, maybe a pilot in the Air Force. Who knows, right? That was a joke. I apologize to the Air Force people out there. I love Air Force guys. I've been in space with some of them, but maybe possibly a test pilot, long shot, maybe even an astronaut. So it shows, how very important inspiration is, and finding that thing that inspires you. And in my case, I was in college and I read the book, The Right Stuff. And I know, some people might think, 18-year-old kid reads book, decides he or she's going to become an astronaut. That's a giant leap. But really, in retrospect, what it was for me was a bunch of much smaller, manageable steps, just one built upon the other. The first one being hard. I mean, when you're a bad student, especially back then, I didn't get much help. I probably have ADD or ADHD, I think was the problem. But, once I got through that initial hurdle of becoming a better student and giving me the ability to focus and pay attention, everything else was a lot smaller and more manageable. So, I encourage the kids out there that are on this call to just find that inspiration wherever you can.
Awesome. Thank you. Tracy.
Yeah, so we want to address as many students' questions as possible. So we're combining a few of the questions that are similar. We have Trey, Megan, Oriana in Santiago in Utah, and Daniela in Colorado, and Ethan in Washington, who are wondering about becoming an astronaut. So you were just discussing this. What do you study? How many years does it take? What does it take to become an astronaut?
Well, when people ask that question, my first, I have to make a few assumptions. One is they're talking about being a NASA astronaut because, that was my experience. I think in the future, since these are kids, there probably will be other opportunities for other kinds of astronauts. We actually have a guy, Chris Ferguson, who was the commander of the last space shuttle, but he's getting ready to be a commercial astronaut for Boeing here. Hopefully this year they'll launch their brand new vehicle to launch people into space to the International Space Station. So there will be other opportunities, but from a NASA perspective, which is my experience and what I'm familiar with, is first you have to meet the basic NASA qualifications. And, those qualifications are, you need to be a US citizen, you need to have a college degree. It needs to be in some technical field like engineering or science, medicine. But when you decide that that's what you want to do, make sure the field you pick is something that interests you. Because if you're interested in it, it has to be qualifying, like I said, but if you're interested in it, you're going to do better at it. And I've been on the astronaut selection board, and one of the things we look for, and anyone who's hiring a person for employment looks for, is how well did they do in their last job? And your performance will in some ways be based on how interested you are in the subject. So choose something that interests you. Don't, become a military pilot because I was a military pilot or other astronauts did something else. Do something you like and then do it well. The other thing NASA looks for is people that demonstrate teamwork. Teamwork is so important. When you are trying to solve complex problems, you don't do it as an individual. Rarely is that an individual act. Most often, it is things that are challenging and difficult are done as part of a team. So someone who has demonstrated good teamwork, leadership, attention to detail. When I was on the selection board, I always liked the people that had, a great work background. And maybe like if you use an example as a scientist, I flew in space with a woman named Tracy Caldwell, who was a PhD chemist by training. Now, I wasn't on her selection board. She was more closely to one of my peers. Even though we weren't in the same class, we were around the same time. But since I flew in space with her, I know a lot about her. And I think one thing that helped her was she was mostly an academic by training, but practically she had this experience working as a journeyman electrician. She was a certified electrician that worked on, I think residential and commercial electrical jobs for her father's business. So when you take somebody that has, a strong academic background and then has some demonstrated skills that are more operational, that's kind of unexpected, is the type of person you think would make a good astronaut. Because when we're in space, not only are you the astronaut, the scientist, the engineer, maybe the commander, you're also the IT person, you're the plumber, you're the electrician, you're the janitor. You do all these, you have to do every job because the space station isn't coming back to Earth. So we look for people that are very well-rounded, demonstrate maybe, some hobbies of living in challenging environments. Mostly that's things like outdoors or, spending a lot of time underwater, things like that. But most important thing is do something you like, because you're going to do it better than if you didn't like it.
That's a great answer. Thank you so much. Hey, Scott, we got this question, or these series of questions from our friends here at the Clark Planetarium, Nick and Lindsay. The first question is, what's your biggest hope for the future of the space program? And the follow-up is what's your favorite story about space that nobody ever asks about?
My hope for the space program is that in my lifetime, so probably, hopefully, I don't know how long that'll be, but hopefully it'll be, enough time to see people put boots on Mars. And it's possible that someone that's watching this this broadcast today, the first people on Mars are probably alive right now, and maybe they're watching. So my hope for the space program is that we do that. We do it safely, and we do it in enough time for me to see it. I know that's being a little bit selfish, but I want to see it.
I do too.
Excitingly, we have a launch of a brand new spacecraft coming up here on May 27th, where two of my former colleagues, Air Force guy Bob Behnken, Colonel Bob Behnken, and a U.S. Marine, Colonel Doug Hurley, will launch on a SpaceX vehicle to the space station. Very, very exciting. And, as we, aspire to go to Mars and meet these other goals, there are important steps along the way. And one is resuming launching people from U.S. soil. And we're hopefully going to do that at the end of the month. I'm excited about it. Don't get in your car and drive down there. NASA administrator said, we don't want anyone doing that, but please follow along and watch on TV. It's going to be great.
And that's awesome. Yeah, the follow-up question was, what's your favorite story about space that nobody ever asks you about?
The reason I remember the stories I remember is because people ask me about them. So it's almost like you're asking me about something that I never talk about. One of the things, I think there's a misconception of why there's a misconception on the public about why people think like flying in space is so great. Things like launching on the rocket, looking out at planet Earth, floating, which is fun, but makes most things, very challenging to do. And yeah, all those things are great. But the best part about it, and I think the big misconception, at least in my case, is that we don't fly in space because we like to ride the rocket or come back in the capsule or the space shuttle. We fly in space because it's an incredibly complicated, challenging thing to do. And we get to do this work with people that are dedicated, that are smart, that are great teammates, not just the people you're with, but the people on the ground at Well that are motivated to work on something in a collaborative, cooperative way, a common goal. And it's something that has serious consequences if you don't do your job properly. And that's what I always liked about it. And the people involved too. That thought kind of takes me back to the beginning of this. We are right now collectively on the same mission. We are doing something that is extremely complicated, and we are doing it in a cooperative way. And it has serious consequences if we don't all follow the guidance and do our jobs well. So I encourage people to look at our collective experience right now in dealing with this pandemic as our shared mission.
Well said. Thank you.
So we have some kiddos here in Utah, as well as from Mexico City, that are wondering about if you get lonely in space and if there's anything that you could do that maybe helped.
Well, I'm a big Elton John fan, and I love the song Rocket Man, but I was never lonely. But I could see how it could be, depending on, the person. I know some people do get lonely. I think, that's not necessarily in my DNA. I don't know, maybe it is. It's kind of hard to talk and think about yourself, but I never felt lonely. I felt very connected to people, in fact, on planet Earth through technology. And the way we did that was we had a phone. It wasn't like a normal phone, but it was like voice over internet kind of phone. Kind of like how we're talking right now, how the audio is working. We had email, we had video conferencing capability. So even though I was in space for 340 days, I was never by myself, but sometimes there was a 6-week period where I was there with 2 Russian cosmonauts, and but I was never lonely. And it's because I took the opportunities that I had, used the technology I had to stay connected with people of Earth. And I think we can do that now. I think most people can. Again, not everyone's situation is the same. I'm sure there are people out there that are by themselves and have very little technological capability to connect with others. But and I feel for those folks. But if you do have that ability, use it. And I found that you always want to find the good parts in things that are bad. And one of the good things I found about this is, having the time now, but because I am, in quarantine basically here, similar to the quarantine we do at NASA, as a matter of fact, before we launch into space, that is I have a lot more time on my hands to connect with friends and family around the world. Actually, yesterday, I had a 45-minute Zoom call with Misha Kornienko, my Russian brother from another mother who I spent nearly a year in space with, and Sergei Volkov, who the three of us came back on the Soyuz in March of 2016. And it was great. We talked for 45 minutes, and I had not seen Sergei in years. I saw Misha. I've seen Misha more recently, but not only have I connected with them, and they're on the other side of the world, but friends and family near and far. So I encourage people to try to do that, and that will hopefully fight, and abate any kind of loneliness they may have.
That's so great. So thinking about, connecting with family and friends, we have a student, Annie, who wrote in, and it's Annie's birthday. And we also have had a bunch of other students write in and say it was their birthday. So I'm just wondering if, you wouldn't mind wishing kids happy birthdays if it's their birthday right now. And then they're wondering about, how do you celebrate birthdays or holidays while you're in space?
Well, happy birthday, Annie, and all the other kids out there and adults. Happy birthday to everyone on Earth whose today is your birthday. So I got everyone covered. Birthdays and holidays are very, very important in space. When your days are very, very similar, and you are in a routine that seemingly doesn't change much, taking every opportunity to change it is very, very important. So we recognize many holidays in space. Birthdays were big ones. We would often give each other presents. I flew some wrapping paper for birthdays and Christmas and other holidays in part of my gear I could bring for myself. A few times I brought, in some cases, I was thoughtful enough to bring some presents. I remember I gave Gennady Padalka, a cosmonaut who spent more days in space than any other human. Fantastic guy. I gave him a U.S. Navy hat with Navy wings on it that I brought up. I gave Misha on his birthday a Leatherman tool that I wrapped up. Sometimes, you might not be as thoughtful. I've flown in space with a lot of people, and maybe you don't recognize you're going to be there with somebody's birthday. You think about it, but sometimes you may just give them something as simple as like your favorite dessert. You wrap it up. The holidays that are big on the space station, the biggest holiday is New Year's Eve. And the reason is this is an international space station. It has 15 different countries, different cultures. So not everyone always, celebrates Christmas or Hanukkah or Passover. The Russian Christmas, we have a lot of Russian cosmonauts. The Russian Christmas is based on a different calendar. So it's January 8th, 7th, I think. So we would generally, celebrate the Christmases, some, but the big holiday was New Year's Eve on the space station.
That's amazing. So I'm going to jump in. Scott, you've mentioned now a few times that you've connected with friends and potentially family around the world. And we're excited and thrilled that we have participants and viewers around the world right now. And so we have viewers from Texas, from Utah, from Belgium, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and they want to know what's the best thing and worst thing about being in space.
Well, the best thing is the fact that you're part of this mission that is much larger than yourself as an individual. Like I said, something that has serious consequences, working, hard at it, not only the time you're in space, but the preparation, the dedication is almost total when you have a job like this. And then doing it with a team of people that you respect, that you enjoy being around. And again, not just your colleagues in space, but the people that train you to get there, the engineers, the technicians, the scientists, all so very dedicated. It's almost like, to digress a little bit, it's almost like that kind of dedication that I experienced at NASA is the kind of dedication I see today, but not, in the neutral buoyancy laboratory where we learn to do spacewalks. Mm-hmm. It's at the grocery store. It's, people that are public servants, people that are on the front lines of this pandemic. You just see, how absolutely dedicated they are. And, some of these people are often overlooked before this, and I hope we never overlook them again, because without them, we wouldn't be able to survive. I mean, the people that, provide, the supply chain in this country, which is absolutely critical. So I digress. That was the best part. The second question was, what is the worst part of being in space?
That's right.
Physically, you don't feel great. You always feel better, but because you're floating, not only are you floating, but your blood is floating inside of you. Gravity, we evolved as a species in gravity. So our cardiovascular system developed to oppose gravity, because gravity is trying to push our blood out of our brain, away from our critical organs that need them the most, down to our legs, And we evolved with a cardiovascular system that was designed to oppose that. So when you get to space, you no longer have that gravity pushing that blood down. It gives you a swollen head. You have more blood in your head. I was reading an article the other day. I was looking through this Flipboard thing I get my news on, and I see my face on there, and it talks about how my brain got bigger, or just astronauts' brains, but it looked like it was my brain. My brother made a joke about it. He said, I should go back to space more and get even a bigger brain. But my counter to that is, well, now my brain is bigger than yours. But my point is, there are physical discomforts that you have to deal with. The carbon dioxide on the space station for a long time was too high. I think they've gotten better at keeping it lower, and that's uncomfortable. It's risky. In some ways I like the risk, and it makes my life as an astronaut or a pilot, it just always made it feel like, I don't know what the right word is, but more meaningful when I had a job that had like serious consequences. But at the same time, it is a risky thing to be doing. So it's not, I've had 3 of my classmates, astronaut classmates, Willie McCool, Dave Brown, and Laurel Clark, and 4 other colleagues were killed on the Space Shuttle Columbia. So there's that risk. So it's really the physical part of it, the risk. The physical symptoms are probably not the least favorite part.
Well, I'm sorry that you lost your friends in that accident. That was terrible. So the follow-up question from that group of our international viewers is, and this may be, we're opening a Pandora's box perhaps. Did you make any mistakes yourself in space?
All the time. It brings up a good point. I think going back to that one of the original questions about becoming an astronaut and what are the skills you need, one big one is you need to trust the people you're with. And you need to trust them, not always to just do the absolute right thing all the time, because that's not really possible. But you need to be able to trust them that they know what their limitations are. They admit to their mistakes. Because when you have a person that doesn't do that tries to cover up their lack of knowledge, their shortcomings, what you get is a very, very dangerous situation. Probably the biggest mistake, I don't know if it's the biggest, because I probably made other mistakes, but one of the biggest I can remember right now is we were on the space station this last time we were moving, the robot arm rides on a rail car. The space station robot arm rides on this rail car that is almost like one of those like old-timey train car things where you can move it by hand. And this thing, you can move it motorized, and it has 2. So there's this motorized part, and then there are these 2 other things that are more like rail cars that you can move, and they're attached sometimes. And so we try to electronically move it's called the MBS, so the thing that the arm's on, and it moves like an inch and it gets stuck. And now it's between its 2 safe positions, and they cannot figure out why it's not moving. And there's a Russian Progress ship that launched, and they can't, or was going to launch, and they can't dock it with it in this intermediate position. So we have this meeting, and we're going through, like, I'm talking to the ground and like, what are the possible things that could have happened? And my flight director, I think it was Emily Nelson, she goes, well, one of the things could have been one of you guys on the last spacewalk could have locked the manual brake by accident. And I said, my response was, that was me. And she goes, are you sure? And I go, I'm not certain, but I'm pretty sure, because I was working on that cart and I was all over those brake handles.
Yeah.
And she was like, are you sure? And I'm like, I'm pretty sure if that's one of the possibilities. So that was probably one of the biggest technical mistakes I've ever made was accidentally locking the brake handle on the Cedo cart and then having to go out and do another spacewalk to fix it, which that was kind of nice because that was a short one. Those spacewalks are usually pretty hard, but if you can just go out for 5 hours, it's a little bit cooler. So we went out. Took me 5 minutes. I went out there. Yep, brakes locked. I was right. That was me. So having a person that you can trust to follow the facts, follow the data, be informed, make decisions that are based on reality, admit when they make mistakes. Those traits are so very important to being an astronaut, clearly important in other parts of our lives as well.
I guess it's kind of difficult to blame that on someone else when there's nobody around for thousands of miles.
I could have blamed it on the guy with me, but it was my fault, so I would never do that.
So we have more time for questions. Of course, thank you so much for being part of our Research Quest Live. For those that are tuning in right now and want to know some of our future events that are part of Research Quest Live, of course, you can visit the museum's website and find all of the information there. So our next question, you were just discussing a little bit ago some of the physical challenges that space creates for the body. And we've received a lot of questions, mostly here in Utah, from folks that are wondering about the tests that were being done with your twin brother and if being in space has affected you, had lasting changes.
So my brother and I were part of this research study. Got the name the twin study because it was, we're identical twins. We're both NASA astronauts. And because of that, our genetics are 99.9% the same. So there was an opportunity to look at the genetic effects of being in space for a long time, using my brother as a control. What I used to say is that when people would ask me, hey, what's the biggest result of that twin study? I used to say, I am now smarter and more handsome than my brother Mark. And it turns out I was maybe half right in that my brain is now bigger, I learned. So anyway, that's still a joke. But there were a lot of interesting results. My telomeres, which are the ends of our chromosomes. And interesting, I'm learning a lot more biology now during this pandemic. I actually read an article, and let me digress, on the CDC website about the 1918 pandemic and how they were able to recreate that 1918 virus. Very interesting article. You can check it out. But there's a lot of biology in there, and I'm learning more about biology as a result of this. You always find the good in the bad. But the ends of our chromosomes are these things called telomeres. And as we age, they get shorter, more frayed, indication of our physical age. One of these experiments, the hypothesis was me in space, all this radiation I'm getting, the microgravity environment, maybe the carbon dioxide, just the stress of living in an isolated place, as my telomeres would get smaller as compared to his. Well, we were surprised to find they actually got better. They got longer in the direction of goodness. And initially, the scientists looked at this and they said, well, maybe it's because you're on a controlled diet in space, you do a lot of exercise. And that was the initial kind of the broad conclusion. For the scientists out there, I do recognize that an experiment with a sample of one is not statistically significant. It's anecdotal information, but they thought the improvement was due to exercise and diet. Turns out, like months later, I was on a conference call and we found out that the Japanese, there's a lot of experiments that go on the space station, over 400 over the course of the year I was there. So some of them, you're not even familiar with what they are, but the Japanese had an experiment on telomeres on these worms that were in space. And the space worms, their telomeres got better compared to the earthworms. And I never once saw those guys on the treadmill, ever, or doing any kind of lifting weights. So there is actually more to this than we suspected. And then mine went quickly back to normal when I got back. So, there were a lot of experiments. There were cognitive studies. I think over the course of the time I was there, my cognition got a little bit better over the year on doing these computer-based tests. But then when I got back, it immediately went south. And I think that's really more due to the fact that I wasn't feeling well. And when you get back, you have physical symptoms. You're tired. You're dizzy. A lot of other things, nauseous. But there were a lot of different experiments. There's actually a great article, I think, in Science Magazine that you can read about. Probably online, you could find it on all the different experiments that were done on my brother and I, and what those results were.
I can see it now, Scott. We're going to have hashtag space worms trending all day. That's great. Yeah. Hey, I wanted to bring the next question back down to earth and get your opinion or your perspective on something that's kind of near and dear to our hearts. Could you comment perhaps on what you think the role of museums and natural history museums, science museums have in engaging and sparking interest in science with our students, and perhaps also with the advancement of scientific research?
One of my earliest memories as a kid was going to the Museum of Natural History in New York City. I think that's
right. The American Museum of Natural History. Oh, I think we may have lost Scott momentarily.
Basically the big museum a friend of mine called me and my iPad was trying to answer. Going to that museum as a kid was, I lived in New Jersey, so it was very close. So we would do like field trips from school. I just loved it, the dinosaurs, all the bugs, and the dioramas of different, parts of our history were incredible and really, sparked my imagination in a lot of ways. Now, again, unfortunately, I never saw myself as being able to be a scientist because I was such a poor student at the time. But it was something that fascinated me. And I would imagine kids are likewise fascinated with this and inspired, and inspiration is so very important. What I've been noticing now, though, in our new reality is how important, science, the humanities, the arts are, and finding ways for people to engage with them from their homes remotely. And I think that in this situation, it causes us to recognize how big of a part these institutions are in our lives and how important they are. So I encourage people to take advantage of whatever opportunity they have to engage, to support, and to help them learn and inspire kids, because science and technology, engineering, math, these things are very important to our future, because those people are the people that solve problems and create things.
Thank you. So in light of the times, we've had a number of questions about getting sick. Can you get sick in space? And David and Kaden from Utah were wondering, what are the measures that you take to prepare yourself, especially in thinking about spreading illnesses to other astronauts?
Yeah, so you can get sick in space. We try very hard to prevent it. We have a quarantine process before launch that lasts anywhere from a week to even much longer. I think in the case of these, the last crew that launched to the space station last week, their quarantine was much longer because of this coronavirus, maybe even more than 2 weeks, and the protocols were more strict because you can carry illnesses to the space station. And so far we've been very good at preventing that. I think there had been cases of maybe on a space shuttle launch, our space shuttle mission, some people having a cold. Definitely, I think Apollo 8, all the crew had a cold on that mission. And when you have a cold or a virus or respiratory symptoms in space, it's worse for a number of reasons. One, you already have more fluid in your head because of the microgravity. The second thing is that that fluid, that extra respiratory fluid, now no longer drains, so that even compounds the situation. And then you're living in a very closed environment that allows those illnesses to spread very quickly. Again, very analogous to our situation here. On the space station, bacteria grows more quickly. I'm not sure why. I'm sure somebody does. Maybe viruses. We were always more concerned with like fungus and bacteria. We would culture the walls. We would clean the walls every day. So our situation here now is very, very similar in that we're living in close quarters with one another, which makes us being able to transmit this virus easier. It seems to be very contagious, which makes it even worse. And we need to treat the place we live in almost like it's the space station. I kind of consider the front door of my house almost like an airlock on the space station, where bad stuff stays outside, good stuff can come inside. We come inside, we wipe all our stuff down, and then on the weekends, just like I did on the space station, we try to clean everything that we put our hands on. You clean everything else like you normally do, but especially the stuff you put your hands on. So yes, colds and viruses, bacterial infections can occur in space, have occurred in space, and we do take that very seriously to prevent it.
All right. Well, thank you for that was a really interesting response to think about, and also so timely. We are going to be moving into the lightning round, and just want to say that we've had so many questions, which has been so great. And I hope that we were able to address some of those. We're hoping to run through a bunch of questions quickly. So maybe like one-word answers or really short responses. What's your favorite space food?
Space food? There was this breakfast granola thing I really liked that I would eat at home, a rehydratable breakfast granola with like milk. If I had it here, I would have it for breakfast.
Cool. What's the food that you missed most when you were in space?
Lettuce.
Do you like Star Wars or Star Trek?
That's a tough one. I used to say Star Wars, but I think I was like, because when I was younger, I was like more of a military, like fighter pilot guy. I think I got older, you get a little bit more introspective and thoughtful maybe. And now I think I more relate to the Star Trek mission, of exploration and discovery without like messing with people's business versus like shooting lasers at them.
Otto in Salt Lake City is wondering, have you ever seen an asteroid?
So an asteroid, meaning like something that's not man-made. I've seen things hit the atmosphere, which, like a meteor, but you don't always know what that is. So maybe, and I'm assuming you mean from the space station. So maybe I have, I don't know.
Jacob in in Spanish Fork, Utah is wondering, Jacob really wants to go to space when he grows up. What is your favorite star?
The sun.
Good choice.
The most important.
Henny from Logan, Utah has asked, do you like puppies? And have you ever been on the moon?
Who doesn't like puppies? There can't be somebody that doesn't like puppies. It's not possible, I don't think. I've never been on the moon, no.
Zoe from Florida is wondering, do you have any pets with you while you're in space?
Not real pets. I mean, sometimes we had some mice on board that were part of a science experiment. It's nice to have them. They take a lot of work though to work with them. But actually, one of my favorite experiments involved the mice. So even though it was a lot of work, I still enjoyed it. I had some flowers on the space station that I got pretty attached to that I was growing, and they almost became like pets. And then I kind of made a pet one time. We had this, and it lived on the space station. It was like a faux pet. It was a fake pet. I took this clear plastic sphere that was part of a Japanese experiment, and it could separate. So it was like basically just like a clear ball, plastic ball. And I took a bunch of Skittles, the candy, the color candy, and I put them inside there, and I closed it, and then I taped it with some space capped on tape. And then I just let it free in the space station. And because of the airflow and the gravity gradient, it would kind of move around and fly around the space station by itself. And I called it Skittles, like it was a dog or something. And I don't know, maybe it's still there. Maybe it's still on the space station. It was kind of like, we kind of treated it a little bit like, hey, where's Skittles?
That's so great. How often did you get to call your friends or family from space?
You could basically call anyone, anywhere, as long as you had the comlink, which probably 50 minutes every hour you would have it. There were blockages with the satellites, so sometimes longer, sometimes shorter. And then of course, you needed to have the time to do it, but you could pick up the phone in the middle of your workday if you had 5 minutes and make a call, which was great for, to be able to call people. For you, it's also kind of cool for them, especially if it's someone that wasn't expecting it. I think Tim Peake, who I was in space with, British astronaut guy, colleague, great guy. He called a woman, dialed the wrong number in the UK, and got in a conversation with someone he didn't know, and I think he eventually convinced her he was in space and just dialed the wrong number.
Oh my gosh. Emily from Utah is wondering, what did you miss most when you were in space?
Again, interestingly enough, what I missed most were people. Kind of like now, you miss being around other people. You like the people you're with, you hope. I, enjoyed all of the crew members I've spent time in space with, but it's the same people like every day. So, they come and go, obviously, but you're there with them for a long time. Very similar here, same people day in and day out. So I miss the people, and I miss going outside. I miss the color green. I miss sun, the rain, the wind. Even though, you get that a little bit in this experience, hopefully people are getting outside because it's important, as long as you're following the guidance, is important to our health. But it's something that we miss in this pandemic experience as well. So people and nature, very analogous to what we're experiencing now.
Mr. Wilson and Mr. Wilson's class in Portugal are wondering, what are the 10 seconds before the rocket launch like? And what does the launch feel like?
So I've flown on two different rockets, the space shuttle and the Russian Soyuz. They are very different. The space shuttle has these solid rocket motors, 7 million pounds of thrust. The last 10 seconds, I was the pilot and the commander. You're pretty busy. So at 6 seconds on the space shuttle, the main engines light. They come up to 100% power. And then at 0, the solid rocket motors light, and you feel every pound of that 7 million pounds of thrust on your back. The Soyuz is different experience because it's there's no solid rocket motors, it's liquid engine, so it does lift off slower, but still similar in that you're leaving the planet. It's an incredible amount of energy. It's controlled. Hopefully, sometimes it doesn't feel like it's controlled, but it is a kind of a controlled explosion. And it is it's definitely an emotional experience going through it, because it's kind of an unnatural act to be rocketing off a planet. Always fun, sometimes scary, but I'd do it again in a second if I had the chance.
Well, I think that ends our lightning round. And so I'll turn it over to Jason.
Excellent. Well, fascinating. And thank you so much for the conversation today, Scott. It's great. I'm sorry to say that we have used up all of our time together today. Once again, I want to really thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your experiences with us. And I'd like to thank everyone who's joined us remotely and sent us your questions from around the world. It's been fantastic. I also want to give a shout out to the Research Quest Live team and to my colleagues here throughout the museum in Utah, who enhance the diversity of voices and provide this awesome content that we're sharing with Research Quest Live. Lastly, I'd like to recognize that this is, in fact, a very difficult time for all of us. Many of our friends and many of our families and communities around the world have been ill or have been lost. So to all of you, Natural History Museum of Utah sends you our best wishes, and we hope that you stay healthy and that you stay well. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you again, Scott.